Hello and welcome to my channel, Skepticus. This is your boy, Adam of Nola, and you are so lucky today. You are tuning in here to the first video in a new series that I'm creating called Cynical Sermons. It seems like these days, even as I say that, thunder happens outside, like God is angry. It seems like these days all I'm doing is creating new video series. My flagship series is God-Free Bible Study. My second series is Got Answers. I will be starting a new series called Christian Fiction that is all about the lies, half-truths, and exaggerations that Christians tell themselves and others. But this series is, I guess you can call it my spillover bucket. All right, all of the rants, all the things I want to talk about that don't necessarily fall under God-Free Bible Study or Got Answers or Christian Fiction, it all will come in Cynical Sermons. So welcome to the first video in this series. And I have to tell you, I was sitting here doing notes for a bunch of videos that I'm going to do. And when I came across this one, I came across this idea and I got so excited. I had to put up the video equipment, get everything set up, and just start recording because I really am excited about this. So the title for today's video, as you may have seen, is The Religious Theory of Stupidity. Let me sound a little confrontational, like you calling me stupid, bro? But let me give you a little background on this before you get too up in up in your feels over this. So there was an individual who lived and died, well, he died about 80 years ago, 1945. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German, I know, shocking, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He unfortunately lived during the time of Nazi Germany. He was born in 1906, but he was not part of the war effort by any means. He was a theologian, a philosopher, a philosopher of sorts, and he's also a Lutheran pastor, okay? So he definitely was coming at this from a religious point of view, and as I already mentioned, you know, he had the misfortune to be living during Nazi Germany, during the time of Nazi Germany. He was executed by the Nazis in 1945. In fact, he was executed a few weeks before the end of the war. So as much as I respect some of the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if there's anything that I do not want to emulate from him, it is his horrible sense of timing. But the fact that he was executed by the Nazis is the first indication that you might have that he was onto something. He was certainly on the right side of something. And it's not just that he was executed randomly at the end of the war. He was involved throughout the war in resistance activities. He specifically was executed because he was involved in a failed plot to assassinate Hitler and wanted to see the downfall of the Nazi regime. So that is why he unfortunately left us in 1945. I don't pretend to know all of Bonhoeffer's writings, but I can tell you that he wrote at length about the ability of normal, everyday people to surrender their capacity for independent moral judgment and rational thought to the authorities around them. Probably sounds kind of familiar, right? Because it said he was living in and died as a part of Nazi Germany. So he was very much dismayed by watching the way, not just the fact that Hitler came to power, which in and of itself was probably depressing enough, and then seeing his country dragged into a war and seeing the atrocities brought by his country against people like the Jews. But I can only imagine what it was like to see his fellow countrymen falling in lockstep behind this regime. And I don't want to fall into histrionics here, go overboard about the state of current day America or anything like that. But I can kind of see this parallel of, there are people around you that you thought were pretty cool, and then The next thing you know, they're singing the tune of the head idiot in charge, and it has to be pretty depressing. But he did more than just get upset about it. Like I said, he actually plotted to overthrow Hitler, and unfortunately he was not successful. But he also did a lot of writing about this. He was on house arrest before he was ultimately executed. But he wrote, one of these things that he wrote was a letter to three of his other co-conspirators long before he was found and executed. It was on the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power. He wrote this thing that he called the Theory of Stupidity. And I really am excited to dive into this because as a skeptic, and yes, as an atheist, I think that there is so much here to draw from and so many lessons to take in current day America, in the current world as a whole. And I think it's really instructive to get into what he meant by this theory of stupidity. Now, first of all, I want to note that when he says stupidity, this does not mean just someone who has a low IQ, someone who is incapable of higher thoughts, someone who has no education or something like that. This doesn't mean a hillbilly or a yokel. No, he is talking about stupidity more in a social sense. It's more of a social disease. It refers to one's capacity to work against their own self-interest and ultimately, in turn, against the self-interest of others. So when Bonhoeffer refers to something like stupidity, he's not talking about your mental capacity. He's talking about whether or not you are actively doing things that you may not realize, but you're actively doing things that work against your own self-interest and the self-interest of others, things that undermine your own security, your own success, your own happiness, etc. And that's what he saw his fellow countrymen doing as they fell in lockstep behind their Führer. Now, all that being said, as much as I appreciate what Bonhoeffer did, I do think that there's essential irony in his work, okay? His insights come, at least primarily, from his critiques of the Nazi regime. I don't know if he fully appreciated at the time how so much of what he was writing could easily be levied against religious traditions and religious sources, centers of power. I don't think that he saw that, understood that parallel, first of all, because he was a Lutheran pastor. He was a theologian. He clearly had interest in Christian ideals. And he wrote other things. He wrote other things that were specific to just theology in general, that weren't about society. He wrote a lot about theories on Christianity, etc. But of course, today we're just going through his theory of stupidity. So I believe by all of his writings he was very much a devout Christian. And I don't think that he quite saw the ironies of some of what he was explaining here when he talked about his theory of stupidity. Nevertheless, you can bet that I do. Because, just as disturbing as these atrocities that were committed by the Nazis, it had to be just outright depressing and dismaying to see the way that your compatriots, an entire nation, would just passively go along with this behavior. And that's a lot of what he's addressing here in this theory of stupidity. So before I get into his theory of stupidity, I'm just going to say one more thing, because I don't want to be subtle about my analogies here, and I don't want to be accused of beating around the bush. So when he talks about stupidity or a stupid person, like I said, he's talking about a social construct. He's talking about those who would align themselves behind horrible power. He's talking about those who have abdicated their ability for rational thought. And he's talking specifically about those that are tied to the Nazi regime. I'm not going to be subtle here. I'm going to draw a direct analogy, because when I read his critique of stupidity and stupid people, here's what I see as the Christian equivalent of that: the apologist. the Christian apologist. And I know that this is getting too overboard with analogies, but I'm only bringing up this analogy because Dietrich Bonhoeffer was living in Nazi Germany and was executed by the Nazis. So that's the only reason why I go so far, is to bring up Nazism at all. Normally, there's an internet rule that says by the time someone brings up Hitler or the Nazis, the conversation's done, right? Like it's all gone overboard. I'm only bringing it up here because the person that I'm speaking of and what he wrote was done during the time of the Nazi regime. But if the people were happy to sing the praises of their Führer, then who is it that really sings the praises of the Christian faith? It's the apologist. And that is what I really want to dive into here. So with no further ado, first we're going to get into the actual text of Bonhoeffer's Theory of Stupidity. It's not a long read. Of course, I'm going to add commentary, but it's only a few pages. Okay, so we're going to read this. I'll be putting it on screen, and we'll make comments accordingly. So starting in on Bonhoeffer's Theory of Stupidity, as the rain comes down. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed and, if need be, prevented by use of force. Evil always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion, in that it leaves behind in human beings at least a sense of unease. I love that he opens with this. It is so much better to have a clear enemy, a clear source of evil. I mean, that's the beauty of Hollywood shoot 'em up, right? You have the good guys and you have the bad guys, and the good guys wear white and the bad guys wear black, or some really cut and dry black and white example like that. And in real life, although it's hard sometimes to even define what is evil and what is not, it is true that evil is much less of an enemy than stupidity, because evil's clear. Evil's out there. Evil has declared itself. And it's better to have that clear enemy, a clear source of evil, than to deal with people or organizations, or in rare cases, entire societies that are merely stupid. Because you can fight evil. You can defeat evil, but you can't defeat stupid. Stupid is undefeated in the history of the world. Now, I want to be really clear here when I say that, because when I say stupid, I don't mean ignorant. Like, when I was younger, I remember me and some of my friends, we used to have a handy little insult we would throw around sometimes and say, you can't fix stupid. And even though it made us laugh, I would always think to myself, well, no, but you can fix stupid, right? Like, you can get educated, you can research, you can go to school, you can read books, like that fixes stupid, right? But now that I'm a little older, I realize that's not really true. You can fix ignorant. You can always fix ignorant by research, schooling, reading, etc. Okay, you can fix ignorance. So first of all, because fixing ignorance implies that you're actually trying to do something to fix it. But stupid is a whole different thing. Stupid, like I said, is pretty much undefeated. Anyone who is wallowing in their stupidity is going to never, ever be defeated by any normal means that we can think of. So that's why I will say again, you can defeat evil, but you can't defeat stupid. Back to his theory of stupidity. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protest nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradicts one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called for than with a malicious one. Never again will we try to persuade the stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. So, beautifully worded paragraph, absolutely correct. I am going to undercut it a little bit and say that there's a really simple way to put this. You guys may have seen this meme before. I have referenced this in other videos, but one of my favorite memes is that you never play chess with a pigeon. Because it doesn't matter. You can checkmate the pigeon. You can checkmate it 10 times over. But it's still going to kick all the pieces over on the board. It's going to shit on the board, and then it's going to strut around like it won. That's why you don't play chess with pigeons. There's no point in it. So read this again when I talk about this meme of playing chess with pigeons, because this is what he's talking about. He says that in such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on the attack. So, in other words, the stupid person is knocking over the pieces, shitting on the board, and then strutting around like it won. Yeah. There are few things more exasperating than dealing with a stupid person. Now, what does any of this... You might be wondering at this point, because this is a channel that's... it's about skepticism. It's also largely about atheism. And you might be wondering, what does any of this have to do with religion? Okay. He's talking about stupid people. He's talking about the people falling in line behind a Nazi dictator and the rise of the Nazi regime. What does any of this have to do with religion? So here's what I want to do. I'm going to go back and read the paragraph that I just read to you. But every time it says stupid or stupidity, we're going to replace that with Christian apologist. So bear with me. Let me read that paragraph one more time. Against Christian apologists, we are defenseless. Neither protest nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the apologist even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they're just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the Christian apologist, in contrast to someone who's simply malicious, is utterly self-satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called for when dealing with a Christian apologist than with a malicious person. Never again will we try to persuade the apologist with reason, for it is senseless and dangerous. I'm going to be frank with you. I just think that Christian apologetics falls so beautifully into this that it is disturbing almost. Now, let me give you a bit of a disclaimer. For the rest, in that case, I read the paragraph, then I talked about it, then I went back and reread it with Christian apologetics, interspersed instead of stupidity. Disclaimer here, I'm going to put words on the screen as I read through the rest of his Theory of Stupidity, and I am going to do this substitution on the fly every time. I'm not going to read the whole thing once and then read it again with the apologetics replaced. So if you're familiar with his Theory of Stupidity and you're like, hey, he does not talk about apologists in here, why are you putting that on the screen? That's why I'm doing this, to prove or to hammer in this analogy. Okay, so moving on with the words slightly altered from Bonhoeffer's Theory of Stupidity. If we want to know how to get the better of Christian apologists, we must seek to understand their nature. This much is certain, that it is in essence not an intellectual defect but a human one. There are human beings who are of remarkably agile intellect, yet they are Christian apologists, and others who are intellectually quite dull, yet anything but apologists. Yes, yes, yes. Okay? I'm bringing this up because, well, not because he wrote it, but I stopped here because as much as I despise the overall cesspool that is Christian apologetics, I would be the first person to tell you that the majority of these people are not unintelligent. Not at all. In fact, many of them are exactly the opposite. Many of these people have spent decades researching their points and then honing them against all who disagree. So even trying to engage a Christian apologist on any matter of doctrine or biblical facts or Christian historicity, etc., it becomes exhausting, because just like you're playing chess with a pigeon, it doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter what the evidence states. They have their talking points that they have spent years honing. And once they have those talking points, they are just going to hammer them home. And to anyone who is not highly educated on the exact point being discussed, they will come across as very convincing. Trust me. They will talk a really good game. And it's not because they're dumb and trying to fool you otherwise. No, a lot of them are very intelligent people that have spent years earnestly studying this stuff. Doesn't mean that they've been following intellectual and scholarly standards, but they haven't been intellectually honest with themselves or others. But that doesn't mean that they are not intellectuals. And that's why it can be very difficult to deal in real time with anyone who is a Christian apologist. Going back to Bonhoeffer's text, we discover this to our surprise in particular situations. The impression one gains is not so much that Christian apologetics is a congenital defect, but that under certain circumstances people are made to be apologetic, or that they allow this to happen to them. Bingo. The apologists are responding to the social pressures of the cult within which they've been raised. Okay? So I'm sure that there are apologists for other religions. Of course, I'm usually talking about the Christian apologists first and foremost, because I'm in the U.S. and Christianity is the dominant religion here. But I'm sure it could apply to other places. But take, for example, someone who is born and raised in the U.S., they are raised with Christianity seeped all around them. Even if you weren't raised in a particularly religious household, the signs of Christianity are all around you. And there are evangelists and fundamentalists all around you who would love to talk to you about Jesus, or would love to hammer home their particular interpretation of the Bible. And they don't just want to talk to you about it. They want to make sure that it's reflected in our laws. And they want to make sure that it's crammed down our children's throats in our public schools. But if that sounds malicious on their part, no, it's more that they are responding to the environment in which they were indoctrinated. Almost every Christian apologist that I've ever experienced probably was raised, that I know of, they were raised in a household where they were expected to parrot all of the dogma that they get from the Christian church. And rather than try to think independently and risk the wrath of their family and their social group and the church within which they are raised, instead they took the other path and they said, I'm going to dive in and be this warrior for Christ. I'm going to learn all the apologetic talking points so that I can shout everyone down who has any type of critical or skeptical thought about my religion. And in turn, they are fed and nurtured by those cult members who they applaud their apologetic forays. You know, everyone else who's of the faith, they are listening to them come up with all these talking points about why the Bible doesn't support slavery, or why the Bible explicitly calls for the Trinity, or whatever other talking point they want to try to hammer into your head today. And all the believers behind them are sitting there like a cheering section going, yay, yay. That's what it's about. It's not a scholarly defect, it's a social defect. Back to Bonhoeffer's text. We note further that people who have isolated themselves from others, or who live in solitude, manifest this defect less frequently than individuals or groups of people inclined or condemned to sociability. Of course. Because despite what the apologist would have you believe, if someone grew up alone on a mountain with no access to church or a Bible, there is no possible way that they would ever come to believe the fantastical claims that are espoused by Christian apologists. First of all, if they grew up alone on a mountain with no Bible, they're not going to be Christians anyway, which also is another ridiculous Christian apologist talking point, that, oh, they would all be Christians regardless. That's a subject for another video. But not only would this person growing up in an isolated state not be a Christian, but when they heard the claims of the Christian apologists, they would scoff at them. Not because they have investigated all of this stuff on this deep scholarly level, but because the claims themselves are inherently ridiculous. And if you were that person raised alone or, with few people around you on a mountain, you weren't raised in a social structure that told you that you have to accept these things and embrace them and love them. Back to his text here. And so it would seem that Christian apologetics is perhaps less a psychological than a sociological problem. It is a particular form of the impact of historical circumstances on human beings, a psychological concomitant of certain external conditions. Upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of Christian power in the public sphere, be it of a political or of a religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with apologetics. It would even seem that this is virtually a sociological, psychological law. The power of the one needs the apologetics of the other, thus highlighting the fact that Christian apologetics is a performative endeavor. One side, the apologists are doing this to perform for their audience. The audience is applauding to beef up their apologists. It is a symbiotic social performance that happens when apologists say we don't need to actually think in a critical way about our religious text or about the actions of the church. All we have to do is be cheerleaders for whatever is the social and religious dogma of the day. Everything that they say or do is for the purpose of gaining applause from those who already follow them. I know that sounds a little cynical, although these are cynical sermons, but I would really love to find how many people are actually converted by the rantings of any apologist. Apologists aren't out there converting people to Christ. Apologists are out there getting the congregation to go, yeah, to get the congregation to feel good about themselves, to feel good about the positions that they and their church leaders and their holy texts have taken. That's really what it's about, is self-affirmation. Back to Bonhoeffer's text. The process at work here is not that particular human capacities, for instance, the intellect, suddenly atrophy or fail. Indeed, as was already stated, most Christian apologists do not lack intellect. Instead, it seems that under the overwhelming impact of rising Christian power, humans are deprived of their inner independence and more or less consciously give up establishing an autonomous position toward the emerging circumstances. Or put more simply, the apologists are bound by the expectations of their tribe. Even the congregation, in this case, this particular sentence from Bonhoeffer I wouldn't say is even about the apologists. In this analogy, I would say it's for everyone in the religion. Because when you are in religion, one of the facets of religion is to subdue your individuality. Now, I'm not saying that you can't be an individual in church. I'm not saying that you're all automatons marching forward and saluting in time. But the group itself does not encourage this massive free expression of individuality. They only encourage expressions of individuality such that they are used to bolster the group dynamic. So you can write new songs all day long, but if you're going to go to church and perform those songs, they need to be something that specifically bolsters the group dynamic. In fact, even if you write new songs that aren't to be sung in church, if they find out that you are writing new songs that don't seem to sufficiently bolster the group dynamic, you can get shit from your own church members. You can express yourself in 1,000 different ways, even as a member of the church, but you are at least on some level expected at all times to bring that expression back to some kind of way that it bolsters the ideas, the dogma, the activities of the church and its members. Back to Bonhoeffer's text. The fact that the Christian apologist is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. Let me say this again. The fact that the Christian apologist is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. The Christian apologist is not out here on his own, just coming up with his own interpretation. He is parroting that which he has been taught by the church. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the Christian apologist will also be capable of any evil and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. This is where the danger of diabolical misuse lurks, for it is this that can once and for all destroy human beings. Now, again, I want to be very clear here. Of course, I told you before I went into this reading, I said I'm going to be switching out anytime I see stupidity or stupid, I'm going to be switching this out with Christian apologists or Christian apologetics. That's really the only change I made to the text. The rest of this text is exactly as Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote it. And notice how you don't have to change much about this text for it to be an eerie indictment on religion, even though Bonhoeffer himself was a religious man, a theologian. But I don't think he fully grasped this. I'm going to read this one more time, because almost all of this is exactly Bonhoeffer's words, word for word. The fact that the Christian apologist is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the Christian apologist will also be capable of any evil and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. This is where the danger of diabolical misuse lurks, for it is this that can once and for all destroy human beings. Yes, 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 yes. Let me take a quick divergence here and say, why am I doing this channel? Why do I do these videos? These take time. I had to buy equipment and, I don't know, sometimes it might be 12 people watching. Why am I even doing this? I think there's a general assumption that, he's an atheist. He just hates Christians. No, I don't hate Christians. I don't hate Christianity. I'm not angry. I don't walk around all day pissed off about Christians or Christianity. But I'm doing this because there is the capability here for very bad things to happen from religion. And when I say capability, I'm not just talking in theory. I'm not going to bog down this video with examples for you of things that have happened under the direct command and auspices of organized religion or Christianity. That's another video and another one that the apologists will just scream and holler over. But I'm not trying to get into the specifics here, but I'm talking about here's what happens when you abdicate. Here's what can absolutely happen when you abdicate your rational thought to those in the cult around you. When you decide that I don't care if these 4 verses all contradict each other. My apologist buddy says that they don't, and he has a whole 30-minute shtick that explains why they don't, and therefore I'm going to say they don't. They don't contradict each other at all. And that may sound like a stupid little example. You may think, well, that's a huge step between that and committing atrocities. But the point is that once you get a people in a mindset where they are no longer using their rational facilities, but instead are abdicating their intelligent thought to those who have created excuses for them, at that point, you can make them do anything. All you have to do is say, we're doing this for God. Once you've gotten them to stop using their rational brain and you've said, just take my apologist excuses verbatim, now you can substitute any crap that you want in there. And I'm not saying that apologists are doing this today. I'm not saying that, everybody who's a Christian apologist is creating an army of people who are going to go out and do atrocities tomorrow. I mean, that's not my point. But my point is that it is deeply disturbing and dangerous anytime you have a significant group of people who have decided, you know what, I don't care if that doesn't make any sense. My religious leader, my Bible study leader, my pastor, my religious confidant, whatever, they've told me that this all makes sense, and therefore I'm going to just say it makes sense. That's when shit gets really dangerous really fast. It's not about hating Christians or Christianity, and there are good things that can come from being a Christian. But when you abdicate your rational thought to those around you, you open yourself up to really dangerous and, yes, sometimes even evil things. People that follow religion are too often they take the most ridiculous tales and they embrace them as gospel. Yes, pun intended. They just eat them up hook, line, and sinker because the Bible says so. My pastor says so, so it's got to be so. I don't know why 3 gods equals 1 God, but the pastor says it's true, and he says it's in the Bible, so I got to believe him. And now at a time when we are witnessing the rise of Christian nationalism in this country and in other countries, but definitely we're seeing this here in America. And with all that's going on in this country right now and in other countries that are being attacked internally by far Christian right groups, you're going to tell me you cannot see any parallels between our current day and what Bonhoeffer was writing against with the Nazis. Okay. Back to his text. It says, at this very point it becomes quite clear that only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome Christian apologetics. Here we must come to terms with the fact that in most cases a genuine internal liberation becomes possible only when external liberation has preceded it. Until then we must abandon all attempts to convince the Christian apologist. This is why I believe that it is largely pointless to debate a Christian apologist. And if you've got a buddy that you eat lunch with or something and you're good friends and he's an apologist and you guys have a good rapport and you can talk about a few of these things, then fine. But, all this YouTube stuff where this atheist debates an apologist, I mean, no one's convincing anyone of anything. And I'm not saying that the atheists aren't stuck in their viewpoint too. So to be clear, I'm not saying that if you're an atheist, you're devoid of these problems. But the apologists, again, it's like playing chess with a pigeon. It doesn't matter what you say. You can't logic them out of this, okay? It doesn't matter how many times you show them all these verses that directly contradict each other. It doesn't matter when you can prove to them that this historical fact out of the Bible didn't happen or doesn't line up with anything else that we know from history. It doesn't matter. No matter what you say, they are still going to knock over all the pieces, shit on the board, and strut around like they won. So the only way that they ever actually come out of this at all is if they are actually extracted, in those rare circumstances where one of them actually leaves the faith. Other than that, there's no point in even trying to debate them on this stuff. Back to his text, it says, this state of affairs explains why in such circumstances our attempts to know what the people really think are in vain, and why under these circumstances this question is so irrelevant for the person who is thinking and acting responsibly. Another way to think about this is that the apologists suck all the air out of the room. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Christians that aren't apologists are all dying to become atheists. That's certainly not the case. But there are Christians out there, many, who can think rationally about their religion, and they do have doubts, even if they won't admit it to their pastor. And they do think that certain parts of the Bible are bullshit. And they still have their faith. And that's fine. But it's almost impossible to really understand what Christianity as a whole believes, or what the tenor of the average Christian is, when the apologists are out there just screaming from the rooftops all of their rehearsed talking points. The word of the Bible, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, declares that the internal liberation of human beings to live the responsible life before God is the only genuine way to overcome Christian apologetics. And here again I say, we see the irony in Bonhoeffer's words. Because after writing this beautiful essay about his theory of stupidity, he ends it by saying basically, the only way around this is to go to God's word. And I'm just saying that, man, when I look through your whole essay, if I just switch out stupidity with apologetics, this really feels just as much a screed against Christianity and religion in general as it does against Nazism. But I understand he was a pastor. He was a theologian. He definitely was not an atheist by any stretch of the imagination. So he was always going to bring it back to that. And his original point in this essay was not to talk about religion. It was to talk about the rise of the Nazi regime. And finally it says, but these thoughts about Christian apologetics also offer consolation in that they utterly forbid us to consider the majority of people to be apologists in every circumstance. It really will depend on whether those in religious power expect more from people's apologetics than from their inner independence and wisdom. So I do like this final point of his. I think it's a very good final point. Just because someone is an apologist doesn't mean that all Christians qualify as such. And some of the stuff that I have leveled against Christianity here in this diatribe may be overly reaching, right? And even if it applies to apologists, not everyone is an apologist. Some people are just Christians trying to go about their day, and they're not making a bunch of stupid excuses for why everything lines up when it doesn't. Okay? So we can't assume that someone is an apologist just because they have taken on the mantle of Christianity. And even for those who are apologists, not all of them are incapable of listening to reason 100% of the time. I mean, most of the times when I've encountered anyone who actually embraces the term of apologist, they're pretty irrational. But it's not a given. It's not the Venn diagram is not a circle. There's a lot of overlap, but it is possible to be an apologist and still be somewhat intellectually curious and somewhat intellectually honest, although it's very rare. There are some who are incapable of that honesty all the time. And all of the apologists are incapable of that honesty some of the time. But ultimately, it's pretty difficult to tell the difference while they're still in the fold. So that has been my whole screed here on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's what he calls the theory of stupidity. I have renamed it the religious theory of stupidity. I hope that you've enjoyed the first episode here of Cynical Sermons. Of course, there will be more in this series. There will also be more coming out every week on my God-free Bible study, on Got Answers. Very soon, as I said, I'll have a fourth and final playlist, which will be Christian fiction, which will be all about the lies, half-truths, and exaggerations that Christians tell themselves and others to sleep well in their bed at night. But again, for right now, this has been a Cynical Sermons, and I am glad that you are here. I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.